Okay, folks, we will make a start. This room is booked the next hour, so I'll have to stick to deadlines. First of all, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to what is a joint seminar between the Pacific Security College and the Department of Pacific Affairs here at the ANU. Let me begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region, on whose traditional lands we're meeting today. Today, we're very excited to be hosting a seminar by two very prominent Pacific policy practitioners and thought leaders. Online, we have Mr. Sione Teki, who's currently with the Faculty of Law at the Auckland University of Technology. And as many of you will know, before that, for I believe 9 years, was the Director of Governance and Engagement with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. And he will be joined here in person by Mr. Joel Nilon, who is currently with the Pacific Security College here at the ANU and was formerly a policy advisor with the Forum Secretariat, and before that was with what is now DPA here at the ANU. So welcome back, both. And the title of the presentation is Reimagining the International Rules-Based Order from a Blue Pacific Perspective. And the broad argument, in brief, is for the consolidation of the Pacific's own vision, interests, and priorities into a distinct rules-based order as the critical next step in the evolution of Pacific regionalism. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Sione online, and then Joel will do the second part.
Thank you very much, moderator. Let me just take this opportunity just to thank you and the team for organizing this event. Let me just start by saying that Joel and I both are fairly new to academia. So we do apologize in advance if in articulating our views, we are not adhering to the rigor of academic research. We do draw on our personal experience and foresight in parts of our argument. One of the reasons Joel and I were motivated in making the move from practice into academia was the freedom to critically assess and critique what we are seeing in practice without being restricted by what traditionally has been the regional bureaucracy. We have seen a lot in our 35 years of combined experience. Over the course of the last 9 years, I have attended the majority of Pacific Island leaders meeting, a significant number of summits between Pacific leaders and a host of world leaders, either bilaterally, regionally, or at the multilateral level. Hundreds of conferences and meetings. A vital observation, all partners, be it the US, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, France, India, the UK, Germany, even China for that matter, political blocs such as the European Union, ASEAN, even the BRICS, have some framing and interpretation on what the rules-based order is and ought to be, and how it needs to be applied, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. There are obviously nuanced terminologies, but I won't get into that today. Suffice to say, however, that some of the framings underpinning the rules-based order are motivated by the maintenance of US primacy, or around the protection of democratic values, or both, while others are framed around the idea of non-interference, territorial integrity, sovereignty, which is usually a code for staying in your own lane, the rejection of foreign intervention based on international law justifications, for example. Similarly, others want to see the rules-based order exists within a more multipolar world, while others aspire for greater influence and centrality, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Each of these framings offer different perspectives on the value of the international system and how it should be structured and governed, reflecting their priorities, whether they be ideological, legal, normative, power-based, or regionally focused. For us, and I'm talking here, Joel and myself, a key observation is that the application of international law and the operation of the multilateral system are colored by these framings, which have implication on the adherence of international law in the real world. A common critique, for example, is that some powers pick and choose what international rules and norms to follow. For Pacific nations, these framings are confusing, often cumbersome. They all sound the same, but underneath the surface are conflicting ideas and values. This is frustrating at the practice level, where Joel and I spent a lot of our working career, because you're struggling to make sense of it all, particularly when you're trying to traverse the corridors of high-level political engagements, especially when there are officials on the other side wanting urgent sign-off. It's about the maintenance of international law and reinforcing multilateralism, some of them would say. It's fine, nothing to worry about, standard language. If we look at all the work that is being driven by Pacific nations, at its core is an ultimate reliance on international law and multilateralism. For example, the climate agenda, the case before the International Court of Justice, interpreting the permanency of maritime zones and the preservation of statehood in the face of sea level rise through the UNCLOS. Current negotiations, for example, within the IMO. The greatest achievements of Pacific regionalism, the Rarotonga Treaty for a nuclear-free Pacific leadership in pushing the world to finally adopt the Paris Agreement. The inclusion of SDGs 14 on oceans, for example, are founded on Pacific nations' confidence in the authenticity of international law and the multilateral system. And such, there are things, I know there are things that needs reforming, but for Pacific nations, the ownership and belief in the multilateral system is at the heart of the new Pacific diplomacy. At its core, for example, the climate agenda requires all nations to come together, especially the big emitters. While everyone through their own framing of the rules-based order posits some articulation of what international law ought to be, the Trump administration has arguably brought about an even greater threat, and that is the total erosion of the international order and ushering a return to populism, unilateralism, and a might is right like foreign policy projection. For small nations, including the Pacific, this is disastrous and undermines the work that they have undertaken for decades, particularly at the global stage. External powers see the Pacific region in ways that reflect their geopolitical interests. Today, it is prominently reflected through security lens, which is driving the intensifying securitization and militarization of the region. Fueling the public discourse, this frame portrays the Pacific as the theater for the great game between the world's superpowers, a theater which subsequently determines how the Pacific is ordered through the various value sets, processes, institutions, and agreements that are put in place by the key actors in the so-called game. But the Pacific has its own way of seeing and framing the region. This framing has been expressed most recently in the coining of the Blue Pacific narrative and the notion of the Blue Pacific continent, through which the region is framed and mapped by its historical, geographical, cultural, economic, and strategic interconnectedness. Its long-term vision is also set out in the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. With the world becoming more uncertain, more complex, more contested, more assertive, the Pacific framing alone will not get Pacific nations to where they need to go in 2050. The Blue Pacific continent must assert its rules, and this implies asserting itself within the geopolitics. Everyone is talking about the global order and what that ought to look like in the Pacific, but the Pacific. But they can only do this together and as a bloc, or they risk being picked off individually. While Joel will delve into the detail, at the heart of our argument is that the Pacific must move beyond the narrative towards an institutionalized set of rules to guide how we project the Blue Pacific continent and how partners act in the Blue Pacific region. In short, what we are saying, if you come to our region, you abide by our rules. We contend, therefore, that the next evolutionary step in Pacific regionalism, in a world that is fast becoming a survival for the fittest, is to project the rules of the Blue Pacific continent. Thank you, and over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Sione, and just to join Sione in thanking Department of Pacific Affairs and also Pacific Security College for the opportunity this afternoon to share some thoughts. Like Sione, I'll provide the caveat that I too am new to academia, and hope that our observations from practice perspectives can be equally of value and of benefit to our deliberations this afternoon. I think just to pick up where Sione left off, we really, and again, based on our observations from practice, especially at the regional level, we really want to iterate that narrative and framing, especially as has been practiced by the Pacific through the Blue Pacific narrative, through strategy like the 2050 strategy that Sione had mentioned, doesn't go far enough for the Pacific to continue to maintain shared interests, cohesion even in these current times. And I think what we'd also say is that there's a real risk of fragmentation in the region and of the region because of the range of factors that Sione also raised. And so again, for us, this sort of leads us to this notion that establishing beyond narrative and beyond strategy, establishing a set of rules to more concretely define and also project the Pacific's interests and its priorities is important. But what we would also say is that it's not something that is really about starting from scratch and trying to identify some things that look like international law or have their basis in international law. There's plenty of existing initiatives, and Sione has mentioned quite a few of these, that the Pacific over time and including more recently has put in place that can be seen as a starting point, a starting sort of basis point for thinking about a set of rules for the Pacific. And some of these are on the screen here. These include recent leaders' declarations in relation to sea level rise, our work, ongoing work as a region to sort of delimit our maritime boundaries amongst one another, the climate litigation measures that Sione also mentioned, our plethora of fisheries and maritime resources agreements, that each of which have some relationship back to international law, and also a plethora of trade agreements as well that are in the region. And again, for us, I think when we're thinking about this transition to a set of rules, these initiatives represent something of a starting point for the development of a more formalized set of rules. But what we would probably say is that it's really important to start to see these initiatives not as isolated pieces of agreements or arrangements, but constituting a more consolidated framework of the Pacific's own rules and to use the terminology, Pacific sort of rules-based order. And I think we also think that consolidating these initiatives more cohesively and together gives us not only us clarity, shared clarity as the Pacific as to what our specific priorities are, but also perhaps a more formalized set of arrangements to enter into with our partners, who obviously there are many and many who want to work in the Pacific. And we also really feel again from a practice point of view that making this sort of transition or shift from narrative and strategy to something more concrete like rules almost represents the next iterative step in bringing the region a bit closer together in a productive way, and possibly the next evolutionary step for Pacific regionalism. And we know that's a big claim to to sort of make. But not only to think about existing initiatives, but we also propose that a rules-based approach could be expanded to include a number of other sort of critical and strategic areas for the Pacific. Again, these you can see on the screen. Of course, rules related to sort of ocean governance and protection, perhaps linked back to the broader global BB&J agreement. Rules surrounding peace and security. Also, in relation again to sort of economic trade and financial arrangements, especially as pertain to the Pacific. And I think we'd also observe here that establishing and progressing some rules in the Pacific, as Sione mentioned before, requires a strong and robust multilateral system and upholding of a respect for the rule of law. And I think we note that thinking about the Pacific moving towards something like this, again, as mentioned, signifies an evolution in the regional discourse. And we'd also say that to prosecute and to advance something like this really requires the region to honestly reflect on the existing state of regionalism, the existing state of the regional architecture, the real truths and challenges that relate to the Pacific standing together as a region, how countries can and should hold one another accountable to decisions and agreements. These things really need to be discussed and in many ways resolved as part of the process of transitioning to something like this rules-based order. And a starting point here is to understand that the projection of this sort of, I guess, outward solidarity and agency depends on, of course, the resolve of Pacific nations to work together. So to project power through a set of rules, of course, that power must be firstly consolidated as a region. Oops. So finally, colleagues, we believe that there is some opportunity for the Ocean of Peace concept that is currently being developed by Pacific Islands Forum leaders and their officials to be sort of considered as a means of considering and advancing this notion of a set of Pacific rules. Just for background, the Ocean of Peace concept was first agreed by leaders, I think, back in November 2023, as a concept to of course define and uphold peace within the region. The process to develop this concept, which I understand will end up becoming a leaders' declaration, is ongoing. But we also understand that there will be some thought given to how the declaration and any principles around an ocean of peace should be implemented, and also any enforcement and accountability be attached to those principles as well. Now, noting the upholding of peace in the Pacific probably require things such as demilitarization, disarmament, and a desire to prevent conflict. We fully believe that the operationalization of principles around these areas requires, again, something that looks like a set of rules that are grounded in international law and not just a set of principles. There needs to be some element of being able to enforce and to hold ourselves and our partners accountable to these principles if this Ocean of Peace concept is going to be effective. So we would really sort of propose here, and if there are any Pacific policymakers that might be listening to this discussion, that when we consider the opportunity for the Ocean of Peace, really to really consider the potential for any principles that emerge to take on something of a binding character in line with the notion of rules that we're sort of really spelling out in our argument here. And again, not only because this is what we see as being, important next step in advancing how we come together as a region, but probably more importantly because, this is the level of collective accord that, we really need in these times to really assert our will and our interests as a region. So again, we do propose that the Ocean of Peace concept that is being developed represents a good opportunity for the approach that we're articulating for to take some shape. And again, if there are any policymakers that are listening, of course, Sione and I would be only too happy to assist. But perhaps to close, colleagues, we also emphasize the establishment of Pacific rules-based order has to be an incremental process. It must be something that commences, we believe, with the consolidation of existing frameworks and agreements. And of course, it requires the careful sort of building of political will around this concept. Of course, there are some practical steps that can be taken, like consolidating, again, the existing declarations and agreements that exist and bringing these together under some sort of framework that consolidates all of these things. And possibly, in future, maybe a code of conduct could emerge as to how Pacific nations should, interact with each other, as well as how partners should interact with the Pacific as well. As mentioned, we also envisage that the issues covered by a set of rules could evolve and expand, and also contributing in the process to the evolution of customary international law. And we also note that rules signify, again, a political undertaking, and this process must, from the outset, be politically led. As mentioned earlier, we believe the expression of a set of rules represents a step in taking forward regionalism in the Pacific. But we would also say that there's opportunity for it to serve as a balance or a counterbalance, I think, as Sione mentioned, to the range of strategic and geopolitical forces and frames that, whether by design or not, serve to shape and order the Pacific in ways that not always represent and reflect the Pacific's own values and, of course, its interests. And by standing together as a bloc, of course, our nations can be just as impactful as external actors in articulating and asserting our interests. Colleagues, lastly, the Pacific today stands at the existential cliff edge due to worsening impacts of climate change, of course, which compound our other vulnerabilities and challenges. And we believe a Pacific-based, rules-based order is critical in realizing the Blue Pacific's development goals and its objectives. It's also critical in brokering peace amongst major powers and also ensuring that the principles and rules of the game reflect peaceful coexistence, particularly within the Pacific context. And Chair, before I close, I'll just invite Sione to provide any final remarks as well. Thanks, Sione.
Thank you, Joel. I mean, and thank you for that. You pretty much summarized everything. But one thing I did want to mention is that moving beyond a narrative to start articulating yourself in the context of rules is by implication an evolution. So like you said, it'll be incremental, but just changing how the Pacific frames and articulates itself through the notion of rules and articulating how they want international law ought to look like is an evolution in itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sione. And again, before I turn to the moderator, perhaps just to frame our overall endeavor here, this is something we've been thinking about for quite a while. We do want to continue refining this approach and this concept. We're hoping to release a few written pieces that reflect some of the things that we've said this afternoon, our colleagues. So we did want to give plenty of time for feedback, and so I'm really looking forward to any criticism, any critique, and any encouragement as well. Sinclair, before I close, just want to acknowledge any excellencies and senior officials who might be in the room from any of our Pacific member nations, and of course other countries, and also those who may be online as well. Thank you very much, colleagues, and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both, Sione and Joel, for a really stimulating and I think very hopeful sort of talk and presentation. So as Joel said, Joel and Sione are really looking for feedback and for your sort of responses to the framing as they have put it for the evolution of regionalism in the next step. So we're open to questions and comments as long as you keep them relatively short, because as I said right at the beginning, we're going to have to leave on time at the end of the hour. We also have scope for people who are our guests online to put their questions into the box. So who would like to, straight away? Siobhan first and then Amanda.
Thank you so much, Sione and Joel. And I wanted to say that I wanted to just start by saying welcome to academia. I think it's fantastic to have people with your expertise in the academy. I think it's a real strength. The question I want to ask you is something that I feel is really assumed in your talk, but I just want to unpack it a little bit. You're talking about developing a Pacific law-based order. And the question I want to ask is, are you assuming that that's a role for the Pacific Island Forum? And the reason I'm asking that is because a lot of the examples you've given are not necessarily things that were developed through the Pacific Island Forum. So I think it's really important to unpack the different pathways for some of those models. So if we take tuna fisheries, if we take ICJ, you know, a lot of the things that I'm really familiar with, if you take some of the climate litigation pathways, they came to the forum as very much developed ideas. So there's a lot of different pathways. The other thing I want to say is, you know, without going into the, you know, the guts of it, the forum has had a lot of governance issues in recent years. There's a lot of cultural diversity across the Pacific region. Does it meet the needs of all members equally? You know, there are other regional organisations that are gaining momentum and support. So I want lots of questions there, but I want to raise that up as an issue because I think it's an assumption that sits behind your talk.
Thank you, Siobhan. I'll offer some very brief response and then maybe turn to Sione. I think that yeah, they're probably, given where we've come from, probably a little bit of an assumption that the forum will have some degree, and again, Sione can reflect his own sort of sense on this, but I think we both know that the forum in and of itself is not the originator of all of the things that are important for the region. I mean, ultimately, it might end up, in my sort of humble opinion, arbitrate any final initiatives, agreements, even legally binding ones that emerge. But as you said, you know, I mean, the forum as a construct, as a political construct, in and of itself has been insufficient to capture the full breadth of things that are important. And I think, you know, even during my time there and some colleagues who were in this room and online's time there had been some reforms to ensure that there was a bigger net that allowed for more things to be put on the forum agenda. And I think if we take that sort of spirit, then you know, I think hopefully, you know, respond. But I think I can only say at this stage, like the forum isn't it's the apex, but it's not the sort of base where everything, you know, can be formulated and developed and originated from. I'll leave it there and probably turn to Sione to also add on to that.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I mean, that's a very pertinent question. My thinking with regards to this issue is that when we're talking about the Pacific, there's an assumption for me, not about the PIFs, but there's an assumption that Pacific nations, even amongst themselves, are able to have the hard conversations to be able to move forward in the next evolution of Pacific regionalism. Because there's an underlying implication that for Pacific to move to the next stage of its evolution, they need to be amongst themselves to be able to agree to be able to move forward together. And that obviously is a big assumption. Where the PIF sits within that, as you rightly say, there are many pathways. And it could be that some rules are developed at the bilateral level or at the sub-regional level, and then it cascades up to the PIF. Or conversely, there could be some initiatives that starts at the PIFs level and cascades down. But what I would say is that the Blue Pacific narrative, as it currently stands, did come from the forum, but is used by all Pacific nations, whether at the bilateral level or at the sub-regional level or at the regional level. It's used as part of its advocacy and projecting its power globally. Similarly, as a first step, you move beyond that narrative to start articulating yourselves in the context of rules. It's important, I think, that the Pacific has a clear statement about how it sees regional, international law and the multilateral system, because everyone seems to have their own articulation of what they want from it. It's important to consolidate what the Pacific wants from the multilateral system. So, as Joel mentioned, I think one part is to consolidate, the other part is to look at how it's projected. And obviously, over time, there'll be other rules that's developed, either at the sub-regional level or at the regional level, cascading down. You know, that's part of the evolution. But just to say that, yes, there's a big assumption here in the context that there's a big onus on Pacific nations themselves to sort themselves, for lack of a better word, to sort themselves out together. And I see that there's a question here relating to deep sea mining. Obviously, that's an issue where if you're looking at it in the context of rules, that's probably an issue that will take quite a long time to deliberate on and think about moving forward. It's probably not something that can be consolidated right now, but we do see that over time, as part of the evolution of rules, that some positioning could be reached with regards to deep sea mining.
I think we had Amanda and then Greg.
Thanks. Just a quick one. I don't think I heard either of you mention the nuclear-free Pacific. Is that another example of the kind of past thing that, like when you had your list of examples? I was just wondering if that's another example or if it doesn't fit for some reason.
No, it fits. I'm pretty sure I mentioned the Rarotonga Treaty as part of my presentation.
Okay, thanks.
Greg?
Thank you both very much. I see this as kind of, I know that it's a long way to go with this project and you're laying out in a sense, the prospectus for it. And I think you've done that very well. Just to go back to Sione's assumption, not assumption, but concern that America, what's been happening recently with Trump and so on, is attacking multilateralism and international law, and therefore the Pacific is affected dramatically by that, given its dependence on these two things. My feeling is that it's really only, I mean, it is the most powerful country in the world that's doing this, the one that set up a lot of this international order, multilateralism and international law. But the rest of the world has bought into this system. And so to me, this is a time for the Pacific to get even more organized on multilateralism and international law with like-minded countries, which is the rest of the world. And to even have tighter relationships with the Caribbean and Africa and South and the Group of 77 and the Europeans and others who are all, and the BRICS, who are all very much now have bought into this system. So this is just that particular point. I thought there's still it's a reason to even move hard on this sort of project that you have. In terms of rules, I get the idea of consolidation, but I kind of wonder what it is. I mean, let's say, and how it differs from what you've got now. From your experience, what is it that frustrates you when you haven't consolidated? For example, AUKUS, nuclear issues, that sort of thing. You go back to the rules. The rules are there in the nuclear-free zone. The leaders looked at that, Forum Secretariat looked at that, saw how far they went, looked at ways they might be changed in the future and so on. How would it be different if there was consolidation? That's what I'm trying to get at here, I guess. If you're in the fisheries area and you're looking at tuna fisheries access, you go to the Tuna Fisheries Treaty, or someone wants to do some drift net fishing, you go to the drift net fishing rules. In other words, we have a very developed system of regional law, as you know, the best in the world probably, most advanced in the world in terms of regional law. It's different from the European Union, which is coming through Parliament, European Parliament. But regional law based on treaty is a very advanced concept in Pacific. And it seems to me that they are called up for particular fights, particular negotiations, particular international negotiations. So how would it differ to have a consolidated thing? You're talking about one book that brings them all together, or what is it what's it look like?
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. Sonia, I'll maybe ask you to answer this first, and then I'll go.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of different levels which you can look at this issue. I mean, for me, I think at the very strategic level, in terms of how you engage, articulating your rules and being clear about what your rules and being clear about your strategic intent actually helps when you're engaging at the political level. So, for example, when you engage at the political level, you're already given framings that then you have to sort of work backwards and then try and negotiate. Whereas if you're clear about what you generally want in terms of a rules-based order from a strategic point of view, it's actually much better at that political level in terms of strategic positioning, diplomacy, and so forth. Obviously, underneath that is the articulation of the rules themselves. And as you say, in some parts, the Pacific has the most advanced rules of the game. But I think the tendency is when we think about these various rules, there's a tendency to think about them in siloed. So, for example, you think about fisheries, but you don't make the connections to how that then connects to some of the other rules that you'd like to take forward. So understanding and consolidating the rules actually, again, helps in terms of how you want to move forward, how you negotiate, how you leverage. And obviously, even underneath that, there's another level where you start developing rules then that, you know, international law, customary law, and so forth. And obviously, that's a very, very long-term approach to what we're trying to do here. So obviously, there are things that quick wins, and those are more in the context of strategic positioning and how you frame yourself. But the long-term intent, obviously, is to get to a stage where there are a clear articulation and a consolidation of rules based on the international law. And I agree with the point also about the fact that, yes, the US is probably the only one that's looking to undermine the international rule system. But the problem is, if you look at the Indo-Pacific framings, some of its closest Western partners, the ideologies and values that sits underneath that is US primacy. So I think there's also a connection there, and I guess that's something to think about moving forward as well.
Good questions, good answers. We have a question up at the back.
So David Naylor, I've got a few different hats up. What I'll sort of ask is make comments in sort of I've been once called an international lawyer dealing with trade agreements. Firstly, I think this is echo comments. This is sort of really timely, really interesting work. On the one hand, I guess talking about sort of the political level of leaders meetings and declarations being essentially statements of policy intent, but treaties themselves being statements of rules or statements of international law. And I think there's probably a lot of things to sort of work through going forward. There's so many different issues in, what is it to assert as rules, I guess, within the Pacific context of these are rules to sort of send out to the world as binding, and the mechanism for that structurally is treaties. And I guess that comment on sort of having coordinated responses, and beneath that being, I guess, not being picked off in bilateral agreements or smaller agreements, whatever you call them, economic partnerships, strategic things, whatever, they're all a form of treaty. And so each of those is an expression of international rules, and the extent to which they're respected reflects that sort of reflects their status under the multilateral system. And there's another aspect which I think has sort of existed for a long time and has come up in PACER Plus and other agreements. And there's also then the capacity of Pacific governments to have and access resources, whether that's personnel or expense or so on, and expertise to negotiate multilateral agreements. Even within the Pacific region, there is sort of a real paucity of trade law experts. And I guess the question in that is sort of, what do you see as sort of some of the ways forward for sort of addressing, I guess, skill shortages, but also that sort of need to coordinate. If it's not strictly through the forum, how do you come together?
Hopefully not more lawyers. Let me just put it that way. Hopefully that's not part of the necessary way forward. But no, I think, again, I'll probably invite Sione to reflect, because he is our legal component of this team. It is a long-term process. This is very much the first sort of articulation of what we see. We see it as necessary for all of the reasons that we reflected on. Of course, it's not a small undertaking. Even the country's ability to implement agreements that they've ratified, also requires support and resources as well. And of course, that would apply, if we were to move towards, something like this. But I can only echo what we've said already, that for us, from a practice point of view, the strategic need to move to something like this, we just sense that that's the way the region probably needs to move. And I would probably reflect that a lot of the risk does sit in being, as you said, picked off, whether it's in smaller ways or bilaterally. And again, as a sort of regional sort of policy specialist, in ways that possibly undermine the broader common good. I'd probably put it like that. But Sione, I'll ask you to respond as well.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I mean, probably just the point to emphasize is that when we're looking at this idea, we're not starting from a clean slate. So obviously, the Pacific has tried to lead on various initiatives that you could categorize as trying to take forward certain rules, whether that's in international law or whether it's regionally or so forth. On the turn side of that is the fact that there's a lot of bilateral engagements and a lot of commitments being made at the bilateral level, which is influenced by a lot of the strategic framing of other partners. So there's an obvious tension there. I guess one of the benefits of this approach is that you're looking at all of these things in its totality. You're looking to consolidate it, and you're looking to try and understand what you're trying to do at the multilateral, what's actually happening at the bilateral level, what's actually happening at the sub-regional level. So probably at its highest level, this is really looking to understand everything that's happening and looking to position the Pacific to be able to understand that this is happening. But because we're doing this, you can actually leverage that of what you're trying to do here. So for me, I think the short term, it's probably useful to unpick what can be done in the short term, which Joel has alluded to, which is basically around looking to consolidate, probably looking at more around strategic engagement and advocacy. But in the long term, you're looking, in the spirit of the 2050 strategy, you're looking to actually establish some international legal customary law or treaties that takes forward and projects the Pacific's position on certain things. And those will be issues based, and depending on the issue, some will be faster than others. But I think first and foremost, I think just understanding it from a rules-based approach, for me personally, I think that in itself is a step forward.
Okay, folks, we're going to have to close down very soon. So I'm going to take two more questions. Could you please make them short and to the point?
Matthew Newhouse has previously worked on a lot of these issues. Thank you for a very clear articulation of the Ocean of Peace concept. My inevitable question goes to China. How do you see it? They're still very engaged in these issues, but with a special interest. How do you see engaging China on the concept?
We'll combine the question.
Yeah, we'll combine them. We want Yambari.
So my question, Yambari from Papua New Guinea. I'm doing a master's in public policy here. I just want to understand back to the question about institutions. Are you maybe also thinking about institutions? Are you advocating maybe for like an Institute of Statecraft, Pacific foreign policy? Is that also an endpoint? And so how do you draw the lines between Pacific interests and maybe colonial interests in the Pacific vis-a-vis Australia and New Zealand, still influencing those discourses?
Sione, do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I didn't say it specifically, but maybe I'll make it more clear, is that the Blue Pacific currently is contested. The Blue Pacific continent itself is contested. It's not just contested by external forces, but it's also contested internally, which was my point before when I was saying that there needs to be some hard conversations and to be able to evolve into the next step in Pacific regionalism, because if that doesn't happen, then the Blue Pacific idea or the Blue Pacific continent will fail, not because of outside forces, but because the house couldn't get its house in order, so to speak. So I think this is where I go back to the point that there is an underlying implication to be able to move forward with this, is that you're able to have hard conversations about, in particular, where Australia sits within all of this, where New Zealand sits within all of this. Similarly, in terms of China, my personal feel is I don't think China is going anywhere. So I think it's important to try and understand, at least in engaging with China, that you've consolidated yourself and you've articulated yourself in terms of this is our standards and our expectations in terms of how you act within our region. So again, it goes back to the phrase I mentioned before. If you come to our region, you operate within our rules. And the same you would say with any other partner outside of China.
Yuni and Joel, do you have a quick response to the final question up there from Alfred on the screen?
Maybe I can quickly respond to that. I mean, I think if it's the Alfred that I think it is, then I mean, I think we as Sione has probably been alluding to as well, a lot of the desire to think about moving from narrative and strategy to something more rules-based is not only intended to hold others accountable, but as Sione has just been saying, ourselves accountable to our agreements, our decisions, and because of all the issues that Sione has also just reflected on as well. So it's not just to hold others more accountable; it's also to hold ourselves more accountable to the decisions that we and the agreements and the treaties that we sign. So thank you.
Sione, final word to you.
No, thank you very much, and I appreciate all the feedback and all the questions. It's it's sort of given me some ideas as well. So thank you very much to everybody, and really appreciate your comments and for joining us today.
Okay, the beginning of a conversation, which will undoubtedly continue. Thanks to everyone here and online, and in particular, thanks to Sione and to Joel. Great.